Hello all and welcome back. We're here with another instrument, this time a George Gemünder viola. I know, what? A viola? But it's from 1884. Now, I'm not a violist. I don't pretend to be one, but this one was just so interesting and pretty that I thought we'd shake things up a bit. So we also brought in our friend and violist, Zakaria Enikeev, to help us out. But before we get into Gemünder's history, let's just take a step back first and look at the United States, the country to which he immigrated a little bit before his time. Now, if you think about it, bowed instruments were around in the United States since the time of colonization, but they were always a bit, how shall we say, unsophisticated. If you think back on that history, the colonies were really working absolutely from the ground up, so every little bit of sophistication and elegance had to be really fought for. That being said, the beginnings of bowed instruments in the US was very much a folk art, whittling your own fiddles, that sort of thing. So this gave way to a very American sort of music that had not much at all to do with the classical music of the same time that was going on in Europe. Remember, this is the time when Mozart was having his heyday in Vienna, the sort of virtuoso that was unheard of. And here in America, we were very much just putting the society together, feeling out into different directions, and of course chafing against the British. There were only a few notable exceptions in stringed instrument making in America, like John Antes, who built a violin in the Moravian settlement of Bethlehem in the Pennsylvania colony, and that was in 1759. So the mere fact that when I'm researching these things and you get phrases like, oh, look at this guy, he made a violin, what a good job, that says an enormous amount. It's not a good or a great violin, it's simply a violin. It's varnished, it's polished, it's meant to be played in the classical style as opposed to a fiddle. So I think it's important to note before we dive too far in that the Gemünder family, fast forwarding into the 19th century, is directly responsible for bringing American instruments into the light of day and fighting that prejudice that nothing of value could come from the New World. I super do not play the viola. I know that some of the excerpts that I'm going to attempt to be playing are in the wrong key because it's easier, so thanks for that, Schubert. Sensitive. You don't have to do, I'm not even putting in like half the amount of weight that I usually do for my violin, and it just speaks. It's really cool. Okay, let's see if I can. The father of our Gemünder dynasty was Johann Georg Heinrich Gemünder, 1782 to 1836. He was a luthier in Ingelfingen in West Germany, working for the Prince of Hohenlohe, and he also had three sons, August, George, and Albert. August and George worked in the shop with their father. Albert took an apprenticeship with an organ maker, and when Johann, the father, died, August took over the shop. And here's where it starts to get interesting. George managed to get an apprenticeship with Villaume in Paris. So Villaume had a huge influence on George's style. The fluting, the arching, F-holes, purfling, all these aspects in his instruments can be compared to Villaume's own instruments. And as he worked in the shop, he came into contact with some of the finest Italian Cremonese instruments owned by some of our favorite violinists of the time, Ole Bull and Louis Spohr. For example, Ole Bull brought in a DeSalo violin to Villaume for repair, and side note, if you haven't seen the DeSalo video that we did before, do check it out, it's one of my favorites. So anyways, he brought in the DeSalo and requested that Villaume himself repair it. But Villaume responded that he had a German in his shop that could do a better job of it, and Gemünder did. let's play this. Let's hear you do it before I completely embarrass myself. But perhaps the most valuable thing George Gemünder learned from Viola was his strong business acumen. Viola understood how to run a shop. He would hire the most talented workers, organizing them in such a way to guarantee that they would produce consistently high quality violins, so uniform in finish and varnish that they could all be the work of a single maker, namely Viola himself, who would then label each instrument by hand. And of course, he was incredibly demanding in his purchasing of the wood, so it had to be old wood, very specifically, which would give the instruments an antique finish in imitation of the great Cremonese instruments. Gemünder soaked up all this knowledge and saved it for the day when he could open his own shop. Awesome sauce. In 1846, August and Albert Gemünder, that's the first and the third son if you didn't remember, they immigrated to Springfield, Massachusetts and opened an organ and piano company. George joined them in 1847 and they randomly became a traveling quartet for a year or two with another musician. So this was clarinet, violin, flute, and bass guitar, which even now is a kind of weird ensemble even for new music. So needless to say, it didn't work out that well and George ran out of money. So he set up shop in Boston repairing violins, and he also sold his own violins and violas for $50 a pop. He eventually decided that Boston was just not big enough of a market for himself, and by 1850 he had settled in Lower Manhattan. Now, New York was already the musical capital of the United States, due in large part to the abundance of German immigrants. New York City also had the only professional orchestra in the nation at the time, so it was the perfect place to enlarge his growing shop. Incidentally, he had also just won the first prize for a quartet of instruments that he'd put out in the Grand Exhibition in London, which in turn really helped to get his career going. Apparently, one of the instruments he had sent to the exhibition was such an excellent copy of the Guarneri Kaiser violin that the judges accused him of simply putting his own label over the original Guarneri. Ole Bull in particular was a great patron of his in America and always took a moment to stop by whenever he was in the city. George eventually settled down, had 11 kids, and bought a farm in Astoria, which is now in Queens. And there, assumedly, there was a lot more space for the kids to run around than in a townhouse in Manhattan. So why Astoria, which in that time was in a rather remote part of Long Island? Well, another stellar example had already been made by another German family. Steinway and Son had moved their piano manufacturing out to Astoria and founded a colony for their own workers known as the Steinway Village. So Gemünder's main shop thereon was in Astoria, where only people looking for the finest instruments would find him, because it was still kind of a schlep to get over there. And he had his son, George Jr., open up a repair shop in Union Square in Manhattan. It should be noted, too, that his brother August had opened up a rivaling store in Manhattan as well, and the third brother, Albert, remember him? He ended up in Columbus, Ohio, where he started business as an organ maker. Gemünder also had quite a reputation, just like Guillaume, in the types of woods that he would pick. He would blend American and old European woods, so American spruce for the bottoms and European wood for the tops a lot of the times. And it's said that a lot of his wood came from the beams of an old demolished Dutch church on the corner of Fulton and William Street in Manhattan. So anytime he would see a good piece of wood, beams from houses, tables at beer gardens, he would insist on acquiring it.
Was it wood from beer gardens?
Yeah, there was a story, I didn't include it, but he was like at a beer garden and he kept on knocking on the table and was like, I need this table. This is a really good one. Like, will you buy this for me? Should I put that in? George Auguste and their sons, the Gemünders had quite the little violin empire in New York City, which was kept running from sun to sun, only finally closing in 1946. There were so many instruments running around and such rivalry continuing between the Queens and Manhattan shops that sometimes it's difficult to sort out which Gemünder is which. Needless to say, the instruments themselves could go from super standard workshop instruments, likely made by one of the Gemunder sons, to top-class, beautiful instruments like this viola. And this viola in particular has, though not a particularly robust sound, an exceedingly sweet and open sound. It's remarkably clear and mellow, and that's unlike most of the violas that I've played, which often seem to be more heavy and enclosed. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this video. As you guys all know, I'm a sucker for history, particularly of the city that I live in. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, leave us a comment, and be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you all later. Cheers.